1. The park was quiet to quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that hangs in the air like a question no one wants to answer. The sun had already begun to dip behind the tall Oregon pines, leaving long shadows stretching. Across the cracked pavement of Magnolia Park, a breeze stirred the swings ever so slightly, creaking chains against metal. And there, beneath the slide, was the only thing out of place, a pink glittery backpack, half-sipped, resting on its side as if someone had just dropped it mid-sentence. No screams, no struggle, no footprints in the mulch, just that backpack, glinting faintly in the dying light, with a juice box still tucked inside, and a name tag sewn into the fabric, Lily Walker. She was 9 years old, brown hair braided neatly down her back, smart, shy, the kind of kid who didn't just follow the rules, she recited them. Her rainbow sneakers were her pride and joy, scuffed from recess but always double-knotted. She was home every day for 15, never late, never lost, never the type to wander. Except today. At 4:32 p.m. her mother called the school office. No answer. At 4:39 she was already in the car, circling blocks with panic creeping into her voice every time she called Lily's name out the window. By 5:10 the local sheriff's department had the park sealed with yellow caution tape, and the search was in full motion. Officers moved in tight, methodical grids. Volunteers arrived in waves. Neighbors, teachers, even teenagers with nothing more than flashlights and borrowed urgency. They combed every inch of the grounds. Bushes were rustled, sheds pried open, storm drains peered into. They yelled her name until it sounded more like a plea than a question. But as the daylight faded and the temperature began its slow descent into night, the voices thinned. The flashlights turned away. The hope, the raw, desperate hope, began to slip into something colder. Officer Daniel Ruiz leaned against the hood of his cruiser, now parked just off the playground loop. His uniform was damp from the misty evening air, his hands resting on his belt with a fatigue that came from more than just being awake too long. This wasn't the first call like this he'd received, probably wouldn't be the last. Another missing kid, another frantic parent. Another hourglass turned upside down with the sand already halfway through. He looked down at the passenger side of the cruiser. Ekko was sitting upright, alert, but still, like a statue carved from focus. The black and tan German Shepherd was older than most active canines, slower, not the one people chose for showy demonstrations or fast chases. But Dan knew better. Ekko wasn't about flash, he was about feel, about knowing. There was no training manual for what Ekko did. No command to explain how he always seemed to pause at the right door, stop at the right bush, stare a little too long at a hallway closet no one thought to check. He wasn't perfect, but he was something more important than perfect. He was persistent. Dan clipped the leash to Ekko's collar. The dog didn't need prompting. He stepped out of the cruiser and immediately lowered his nose, sniffing the wind, the earth, the air, like he was reading a book only he could see. They entered Magnolia Park at 6:42 p.m. Flashlights still dotted the open field. A drone buzzed. Overhead, media vans lined the edge of the street with their floodlights off, but cameras at the ready, waiting for a resolution. Dan was handed a laminated map with the current search grid. A volunteer coordinator spoke quickly, almost mechanically. She was last seen on the swings. Alone, right after school, then gone. No one saw her leave. Backpack was found here. He pointed to the map. Don nodded, clipped Ekko's lead shorter, and whispered, "Let's work." Ekko moved without hesitation, sweeping in a wide arc along the perimeter of the swings, around picnic benches and trash cans, weaving between low-hanging branches like he was chasing a ghost. For 15 minutes, he looped the same section of grass, circling wider each time, doubling back, then stopping abruptly at a chain-link fence near the edge of the park. He sat. Dan watched closely. The tail was still, the ears forward, but not twitching. Ekko was picking up something faint, something different. The wind shifted slightly. Then Ekko moved again, faster now, his paws barely making a sound against the damp earth. He headed straight for the creek bed that curled behind the park like a forgotten scar. There, at the edge of the concrete, was the mouth of a storm drain, cracked, moss-covered, ringed in rust. Just tall enough for a child to crawl into, just forgotten enough for adults to overlook. Ekko stopped. His body tensed. He didn't bark. Instead, a low, aching whimper escaped his throat. Dan stepped beside him, shined his flashlight into the tunnel. Shadows leaped against the rounded walls. Leaves clung to wet concrete. Nothing moved, no sound. He crouched lower. Nothing but runoff and darkness. A search supervisor approached. Already checked that one. Drainage only. Doesn't go more than 30 feet. She wouldn't have fit, or gone far, if she did. Dan didn't look away. Ekko thinks otherwise. He's picking up residual scent, the man offered. Old trace, maybe from another kid, but Dan knew better. He knew Ekko. They moved on at least, Dan did. Ekko stayed behind, tail stiff. Eyes locked on the tunnel like it might blink. Dan called him. Twice. Ekko walked a few feet, then circled. Right back, same posture, same stillness. By midnight, the rain had started. Not a downpour, just that steady Oregon drizzle that makes every branch sag and every searcher feel heavier. The teams were thinning. People needed rest, needed warmth, needed to believe someone else would take over. But Lily Walker was still gone. At the sheriff's office, hours later, Don stood in front of the evidence corkboard, eyes tracing the pins. And notes and radio logs. Ekko lay on the ground, paws crossed, but his eyes were still watching, still facing the door. Every few minutes, he'd lift his head, ears perked not at a sound, but at the idea of one. You still think she's there? Dan asked softly. Ekko didn't blink. Dan grabbed his coat. Okay, he whispered. Let's go. And together, without backup, without orders, without anyone watching, they went back to the park. Just a man and a dog, returning to the place everyone else had already left behind. The morning air was sharp, cold enough to sting Dan's nose as he stepped out of the cruiser. No cameras, no volunteers, just dew-covered grass and trees that still held shadows from the night before. The sun was only beginning to rise, casting a dull gold hue over Magnolia Park. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that made everything feel suspended. As if the world hadn't quite decided whether to keep going or pause for breath. Ekko didn't wait for a command. He leaped from the cruiser the second the engine cut, paws hitting the ground with a sense of purpose that made Dan quicken his step. The German Shepherd didn't sniff around or wander. He moved like a soldier on a mission, straight toward the storm drain. Dan followed, boots crunching over fallen leaves. When he reached the edge of the concrete pipe, Ekko was already there, sitting still, posture rigid. His eyes weren't scanning or watching the trees. They were locked on the darkness. Within that tunnel, no tail wagging, no shifting weight, just stillness. Like a statue carved from loyalty, Dan stood beside him, heart already starting to thud in his chest. There was something different this time, not just instinct. It was the way Ekko stared, not with alertness, but with something more vulnerable, desperate, almost pleading, as if he wasn't trying to signal where to go, but begging Dan to trust him. He crouched low and shined his flashlight into the tunnel again. It looked the same. Wet walls. A streak of algae. Leaves curled in a corner. But then, just as he was about to pull away, something shifted. Or maybe he imagined it. A flicker of movement. He blinked. Nothing. He turned off the light and leaned. In listening, a second passed, then another. And then so faint he thought it might be, the wind came a sound. A soft, dragging scrape. Like fabric brushing against concrete. Dan's breath caught. He squinted into the dark. That's when he saw it. A hand, small, pale, fingers trembling as they slowly reached around a bend in the tunnel wall. Hesitant, barely moving. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Everything, the cold, the quiet, the ache in his spine vanished beneath a single, powerful wave of adrenaline. Lily, he whispered, his voice cracking as the word left him. He reached forward gently. Not wanting to startle her, his voice dropped low, careful and soothing. It's okay, you're safe now, I see you. There was no answer. Just the faint shuffle of the hand retreating, disappearing behind the curve. Dan immediately pulled out his radio. This is Ruiz, I have visual on the missing child. Magnolia Park. Inside the storm drain. Repeat, inside the storm drain. Need paramedics and rescue team ASAP. He didn't wait for confirmation. He dropped to his hands and knees and began crawling into the pipe. It was cramped and damp. The smell of wet moss and rust filled his nose. His flashlight beam bounced off the curved walls, casting shaky shadows. Lily, he called again, softer now. I'm coming. Just keep listening to my voice. Further in, he saw her, curled up in the bend of the tunnel, her body wedged into a dry pocket just above the runoff stream. Her face was dirty, lips pale. Her rainbow sneakers, one missing a lace, stuck beneath her legs. She didn't cry, she just stared, wide-eyed, too exhausted for fear. Don stopped just short of her, afraid any sudden move might scare her deeper in. I'm Don, he said. This is Ekko. He's my partner. You heard him, didn't you? Her lips parted slightly. The dog, she whispered. He was there. A shiver racked her body. Don took off his jacket and slowly passed it to her. We're going to get you out of here, okay? Just hold on. Rescue crews arrived minutes later. With careful hands and practiced precision, they pulled Lily from the tunnel and wrapped her in a foil blanket. She was soaked, freezing, but alive. Paramedics examined her on-site before loading her into the ambulance. Dan stood nearby, watching as Ekko sat beside the stretcher, licking her wrist gently. Lily's eyes stayed locked on him. I stayed awake, she murmured to no one in particular, because I heard him, the dog, he didn't leave. Don swallowed the lump in his throat and looked away. Later, at the hospital, doctors confirmed she was dehydrated and hypothermic, but stable. She hadn't suffered any visible injuries, but her story came out in fragments. A man in a hoodie, following her after school. No one saw it. She ran, hid, crawled into the pipe when she couldn't shake him, and then she got lost. She said the darkness closed in like a blanket. She curled up, thinking maybe someone would come. But hours passed. Then rain, then night. She stayed because she didn't know where else to go. She stayed because she thought no one was looking anymore. But then, she heard it. A sound outside. The pipe, not footsteps, not a voice, a presence. The kind of sound that doesn't come from the outside, but reaches something deep in the chest. Ekko's whimper, she knew, in that moment. Someone hadn't given up. Don tried to write the report later that evening, but the words wouldn't settle on the page. The sheriff's office was full of congratulatory chatter. Reporters called it a miracle. Girl found after 48 hours in storm drain. One headline read. Another praised the community for its effort. A third credited Dan directly. None of them mentioned the dog, who sat vigil in the rain, waiting outside a hole in the ground, long after the world had turned its back. The photos on the news showed Lily, wrapped in a silver blanket, leaning against a medic. Ekko was beside her, stoic, calm eyes focused straight ahead. They looked like they had done this 100 times before. But this wasn't just another call. Not for Dan, not for Ekko, and definitely not for Lily. Because in the silence of that drain, while the world moved on and the lights shut off and hope dimmed, a girl clung to life not because of protocol, not because of procedure, but because one dog wouldn't walk away. Back at home that night, Ekko lay curled beside Dan's boots, eyes half closed. Dan reached down and scratched behind his ears. You knew, he said quietly. Ekko didn't move, but Dan didn't need him to. 3. The praise came quickly, as it always did in small towns. Headlines filled with words like miracle and hero. Photos of Lily smiling weakly from her hospital bed appeared on morning shows and news feeds. There was even talk of a community parade, balloons, banners, well wishes. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. But by day 3, the applause started to fade, replaced by something colder, whispers, doubts. She must have wandered in there herself. Why didn't she scream sooner? Maybe it wasn't an abduction at all. Dan heard the first murmurs at the station. Casual offhand remarks passed like gossip around the break room coffee pot. Some officers didn't mean anything by it. Others did. Then someone dropped a sealed manila envelope on Dan's desk. No name attached. The label read, Lily Walker, Internal Review. Inside were typed notes. Timeline summaries. A short paragraph from a behavioral analyst out of Salem who had never met Lily. One phrase stood out underlined in red ink. Possible fabrication or trauma-induced confusion. Don read the page twice. His jaw tensed. Across the room, Ekko lay. Beside the door, his eyes open and steady. Don didn't have to say a word. Ekko's tail thumped once. They both knew she hadn't made it up. That afternoon, Don didn't file a complaint or schedule a meeting. He simply grabbed his coat, slipped his notebook into his pocket, and whistled for Ekko. They drove back to Magnolia Park. No press, no search teams, no curious onlookers. Just early evening sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over wet grass. Ekko didn't hesitate. As soon as the cruiser door opened, he was out and running, not aimlessly, but with the same doctor he'd shown the first night. He returned straight to the storm drain, sniffed once, and turned. Then he trotted past it, toward the wooded edge of the park. Don followed, notebook in hand, beyond the tree line. Where the brush grew thicker and less cared for, Ekko slowed. He sniffed at the base of a tree, circled twice, then stopped. Dan looked. Down the grass was flattened slightly. Not much, but enough. Nearby, something glinted under a leaf. He knelt. A juice box, crushed. Same brand as the one in Lily's backpack. Dan picked it up with a gloved hand. He turned slowly, scanning the area. Ekko had moved several feet away and was now nosing a stretch of barbed wire that marked the boundary between the park and an overgrown maintenance road. Something fluttered in the wind caught on the wire. Dan approached. A torn piece of dark fabric stuck to the metal prongs. He pulled out his phone and took photos of the juice box, the grass, the cloth. Partial footprint in the mud nearby. Large, too large for a child. It wasn't conclusive. It wasn't enough for a case, but it was something. That night, Don sat across from Mia Reynolds at a quiet diner on the edge of town. She sipped her coffee, leaning over his phone as he showed her the photos. She was chaste. Mia said flatly, "This isn't a case of a kid running off. Look at the spacing here. Whoever was behind her wasn't walking. They were hunting." Dan nodded. "No one believes it." "They don't want to believe it," she replied, setting her mug down. "You open that door, and suddenly you're admitting there's a predator operating in a public park. That's not something anyone wants to say into a microphone." Dan looked out the window. The streetlights buzzed faintly outside. "So we just move on." Mia slid the juice box across the table. "We keep looking." Off the books. For the rest of the week, Dan and Ekko returned to the park nightly. No fanfare, no flashlight grids, or radio chatter. Just a man, a dog, and a growing sense that something was still hiding out there. Ekko led them further each night, past the edge of the official search radius, behind utility sheds, along the back of chain-link fences. One night, he stopped beside a pile of branches and growled low. Don moved them aside. Underneath was a rusted flashlight, dead battery, covered in dirt. Another night, Ekko fixated on a stretch of fence that looked ordinary until Don got closer. It had been bent outward, then pulled back into shape and tied with two plastic zip ties. Not broken, just opened purposefully. Too many signs, not enough proof. Dan started logging everything in a separate file. Not at the station, at home. If the department wouldn't take it seriously, he would, quietly, methodically. Then, on Friday night, Ekko did something he hadn't done since the night they found Lily. He stopped cold in the woods and whimpered. Not at a tree, not at a fence. At a small pile of rocks just off the trail. His ears were back, his body low. He pawed once at the stones. Dan approached, heart thudding. He moved the rocks aside. Beneath them was a shallow dugout, no more than a foot deep. Inside, a torn black hoodie, size indeterminate, too big for a child, too small for a grown man. In the pocket, a burner phone. Battery dead. Dan exhaled slowly. "Got you," he muttered. He took it home, plugged it into a universal charger. The phone powered on. No texts, no contacts. Just a single image, saved to the gallery. A blurry photo of the Magnolia Park sign. Timestamped, 2 hours before. Lily went missing. Dan stared at it. His hand clenched the phone. He called Mia. "You were right," he said. He was there before. By morning, Mia had traced the photo's metadata to a cloud backup email. Disposable. But that email had been used before, linked to 3 other burner phones, all tied to reports of loitering near schools, daycares, even a public pool. Spread across the state, always the same description: black SUV, dark windows. No front plate. Dan went into the station Monday morning with the phone in hand. He dropped it on the captain's desk. "You need to reopen the case," he said. The captain frowned. "Where'd you get this?" "Ekko tracked it," Dan said flatly. "Off the books. You realize this isn't proper chain of custody." Dan didn't flinch. Chain of custody didn't find Lily. Silence. The captain leaned back in his chair. "I'll elevate it quietly. But don't go rogue again." Dan nodded once. That was all he needed. That evening, he visited Lily at the hospital again. She was stronger now, sitting up, drawing with crayons. When she saw Ekko, she smiled wide and motioned for him. He trotted to her bedside and rested his head on the mattress. "I told Mum I want to be like Ekko when I grow up," she said. Don smiled. "You mean strong and quiet?" She nodded, and brave. Ekko nudged her hand with his nose. Dan didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because somewhere out there, someone was still moving, still watching. But now, Dan had a direction. And he wasn't alone. Ekko was with him. And neither of them was giving up. For the trail pointed east, Silverside was 2 hours away. Tucked along a quiet stretch of rural highway lined with orchards and broken-down gas stations. A town most people passed through without stopping. But the black SUV had stopped there, parked behind a convenience store near Route 39, caught by a grainy security camera just a day before Lily disappeared. Dan didn't tell anyone he was going. No paperwork, no backup, just him and Ekko in the unmarked Explorer, leaving before sunrise under a sky still holding onto the last stars. They rolled into Silverside at 8:15 a.m. The streets were still quiet. Dan didn't go to the local police station. He went straight to the convenience store. The clerk behind the counter, an older man with silver stubble and a John Deere cap, barely looked up from his crossword until Dan showed him the blurry cam still of the SUV. "That's the one," the man said. "Didn't have a front plate. Real shiny, real dark. Guy didn't come in. Just sat in the lot for a while. Gave me a weird feeling." "Did you get a look at the driver?" The clerk shook his head. "Not really. Hoodie, ball cap. Didn't get out till I wasn't looking. Then just vanished." Dan thanked him and stepped outside. Ekko was already out of the car, nose to the ground. They began to canvass the area, slowly circling the lot, checking every alley, ditch, and fence line. Then Ekko stopped. Low growl. Head turned toward the tree line behind the store. A drainage ditch separated the pavement from a thin line of trees. Ekko stared into it like it had spoken his name. Don knew that look. They followed the ditch into the trees, crawling through a gap in a bent fence. The brush thickened, dry branches cracking underfoot. Then the trees opened up into a clearing, and there it was, an old barn, long abandoned. Half of its roof had caved in, and the wooden siding had gone grey with time. Tools hung rusted on the outer walls, some still swinging faintly in the morning breeze. Ekko crept toward the barn and stopped near the entrance. One short bark, that was all. Don drew his sidearm, heart beginning to race. Inside, it was dark, damp, and cold. The scent hit him immediately: mold, gasoline, and something else. Something stale. Old tarps covered a pile in the corner. Ekko sniffed the air, stiffened, then growled low. Don stepped forward and peeled one tarp back. 3 large plastic bins. He opened the first fast food wrappers, crumpled napkins, paper, bags, the second zip ties, duct tape, a flashlight with no batteries, the third children's clothes, tiny jackets, a red backpack with peeling stickers, a pink shoe with glitter rubbed halfway off. Don took a step back, chest tight. He didn't touch anything, just pulled out his phone and took photo after photo, every angle, every label. Then Ekko barked again, sharper. Now a warning. Dan turned toward the back wall. Behind a sagging hay bale was a door he hadn't noticed at first. More of a hatch. Then a door, wooden, patched with plywood, bolted shut. Dan unlatched it, slowly. A tunnel. Rough dirt walls, reinforced with scavenged lumber, no more than 15 feet long. The air inside was colder, still. Ekko wouldn't go in. He stood at the entrance, tail low, ears back. He whimpered once, then sat. Dan didn't need more. He backed out, heart pounding, called MIA. "You're not going to believe what we just found." He sent the photos, the location, a clipped voice message. Her reply came within minutes. "Stash house," she said. "Predators sometimes build them. Places to hide, prep, stage. This guy didn't just pass through side, he planted himself here." Dan nodded to himself, eyes still scanning the clearing. "It's worse than we thought." He wanted to stay, stake it out, wait for the driver to return. But protocol and instinct told him no. They needed a net, not a shootout. He flagged the location through a quiet task force contact, anonymously. That would buy them a day, maybe 2. On the way back to town, Dan stopped to fill the gas tank. Ekko sat alert in the passenger seat, eyes scanning the lot. Then, without warning, he growled low and deep. Don looked up. Across the road, parked beside a row of mailboxes, was a black SUV, engine running, windows tinted, no front plate. Dan's heart skipped. His hand hovered near his radio, then dropped. They had no warrant, no jurisdiction, no legal cause, but they had Ekko. He climbed into the driver's seat, pulled out casually, looped around the block, and parked behind a taco truck with a clean view of the SUV. "Killed the engine. Okay, buddy," he whispered. "Let's see who this guy is." 10 minutes passed. Then the SUV door opened. A man stepped out. Hoodie, ball cap, medium build, clean sneakers. He walked to the back of the vehicle, opened the hatch, and pulled out a large black trash bag. Heavy. Dan's breath caught. The man walked toward a nearby shed behind a row of old apartment garages. Disappeared behind it. Don got out. Ekko followed. They moved low, silent along the side of a fence. Then up the back of the shed. Don peeked around the corner. The man was digging shallow hole, small shovel. The bag at his side. Don raised his phone, snapped burst photos, then he stepped forward, weapon drawn. "Sheriff's Department, don't move." The man froze, then bolted. Don shouted, "Ekko, track." The dog exploded forward. It took less than 50 yards. Ekko lunged, latched onto the man's leg, and brought him down hard. Dan cuffed him seconds later. The man said nothing. No struggle, no words, just silence. Don retrieved the trash bag. Inside, photographs, dozens. Kids in parks, on swing sets, outside schools, some recent, some faded. None of them belonged to him. Back at the station, the man refused to speak. No name, no ID, nothing but a wall of silence. But the photos were enough to pull in federal agents. Enough to escalate everything. Don sat outside the precinct that night, Ekko at his feet. "Mia called. You did it," she said. Don shook his head. "No, we did." He looked at Ekko. "He did." The next day, Don visited Lily again. She was smiling more. When she saw him, she ran up and threw her arms around Ekko. "I knew he was magic," she said. Don smiled. "He's just a dog." She pulled back. "No, he's the dog." Later, back at home, Dan added one more pin to the board's silver side. Ekko lay beneath it, eyes closed, finally resting. But Dan knew this wasn't the end. Asterisk 5. The knock on Dan's door came late, just after sunset. He opened it to find a courier standing with a slim envelope marked with the sheriff's seal. Inside was a single-page notice that you are officially suspended pending review of unauthorized field activity, effective immediately. Don read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in the trash. The badge had become a formality. What mattered now wasn't chain of command, it was what they'd found, what they hadn't yet uncovered, and what still lingered out there in the spaces between towns and silence. Ekko didn't notice the change. Or maybe he did, but he didn't care that night. He paced the hallway more than usual, restless. Dan sat beside him, running a hand down his back. "We're not done, are we?" he murmured. ITH eyes didn't blink. The next morning, while Dan sifted through old case notes, at the kitchen table, Ekko barked sharply. Not a warning, not excitement, a summon. Dan followed the dog into the hallway. Ekko stood in front of the floor vent, body still, nose aimed straight down. Then he gave a low whine and tapped the vent cover once with his paw. Dan crouched. The metal was cold. Dust had gathered around the edges. He grabbed a screwdriver and pried it loose. Inside, wedged deep into the ductwork, was a small fabric-covered book. He pulled it out carefully, wiping the dust away. The cover was pale pink, faded with time. The first page read, Samantha D., October 12, 2016. Dan stared at the name. He didn't recognize it. He brought the book to Mia that afternoon. She sat silently across from him at her dining room table, flipping pages with deliberate care, like disarming a bomb. "This isn't fiction," she said at last. The entries were short but chilling. A girl locked somewhere dark. Mentions of a voice outside the door. Meals left at irregular hours. Sounds of other children in the distance, but never any faces. "She talks about counting cracks in the walls," Mia whispered. "About dreaming of her dog." She even drew pictures of him on the last pages. One sketch showed a dog sitting at the base of stairs. Written above it in a child's uneven handwriting, "I heard him, but he didn't find me." Dan's jaw tightened. This wasn't Lily? "No," Mia said quietly. This was someone before her. Don drove back to the barn in Silverside that night, now wrapped in federal tape. He called in a favor, got access for a short window. No agents, no flashlights, just Dan and Ekko under a gray sky. Ekko sniffed the perimeter, nose low, tail stiff. He paused near the back wall, then sat and whined softly. Don tapped along the floorboards, listening for hollows. He found one, prying it up. He uncovered another crawl tunnel, smaller than the first. Inside were a crumpled blanket, 2 empty juice boxes, and a pair of dusty ballet slippers. Small, pink, worn. Dan stared for a long time. They had missed her. Over the next 48 hours, with the help of ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, 3 more dugouts were found within a quarter-mile radius of the barn. All hidden, all lived in. No remains. Just traces, drawings, food wrappers, worn socks. The case was reclassified. Serial abduction. Don stood at the edge of one of the dugouts, staring down into the shallow pit. "How many didn't we save?" he whispered. Ekko barked once. At nothing. Or maybe at something only he could sense. That night, Dan sat on the floor with the diary open on his lap. He circled every name, every place, every time mentioned in the child's scrawl. One phrase kept repeating. The house with yellow stairs, no address, no town, just those words, over and over. He called Mia. "Does that mean anything to you?" "No," she said. "But maybe it means something to Ekko." For the next 5 days, Dan drove rural roads, miles of farmland and sleepy intersections, keeping one eye on the map and one on Ekko. The dog sat in the front seat, now alert, scanning every structure they passed. Nothing, until Thursday morning. Dan had just stepped out of a gas station, coffee in hand. when he saw Ekko standing on the hood of the truck, ears forward, body rigid. "What is it?" Ekko leaped down and ran toward a property across the road, an old ranch house, partially hidden behind overgrown hedges. The front porch had peeling paint. The stairs, wooden, wide, unmistakably yellow. Stomach dropped. He called it in as a welfare check. Standard code. The deputy who arrived looked unsure. Dan waved his old badge. "I'll take the lead." They knocked 3 times. No answer. Windows dark, curtains drawn. Dan circled to the back. A shed sat half open. Ekko growled as they approached. Inside, a cot, a bucket, a chain lock from the outside. He stepped back. "This isn't a shed," he muttered. "It's a cage." A warrant was issued within the hour. Inside the house, they found a single bedroom in use. The rest was storage, hundreds of boxes, files, clothes, shoes, old IDs, Polaroids. 3 more missing girls were identified through the notes. Each had been relocated years earlier. Each had filed inconsistent reports that no one had connected. But now the lines converged. The house, the photos, the items. 1 man, 1 network, and 1 dog that had never stopped searching. Dan was asked to bring Ekko to a school presentation. 2 weeks later, Lily's school. She was there in the front row, taller now, hair neatly braided. When she saw him, she ran forward and hugged Ekko tightly. "I told my class, he saved me," she said. "But I know he doesn't like being the center of attention." Dan laughed. He likes kids more than cameras. Later that evening, Dan sat on his porch with a notebook in his lap, and Ekko curled at his feet. The wind was gentle. The silence, for once, felt earned. "You're tired," he said softly. Ekko didn't respond. Just lifted his head, then settled back down. The mission wasn't over. But for the first time, Dan believed they might finally be ahead. *6. The days after the Yellow House raid blurred together. Local headlines faded. Federal agents boxed up evidence and disappeared. Official statements were vague, careful. The town moved on, or pretended to, but Dan couldn't. Ekko wouldn't. Let him dot at night, the dog paced. He sat near windows and stared out at nothing, ears twitching. He stood at the basement door for long stretches, unmoving. "He knows something's not done," Dan told Mia over the phone. "It's not behavior, it's instinct." Mia didn't argue. Dogs like Ekko, they're like tuning forks for trauma. They don't know why something's wrong. They just know it is. Don ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion dragging at every word. "The guy we caught, he still won't talk. Not a name, not a single address. And every site we've tracked through his notes, nothing but gear, prep rooms. No victims." Silence on the line. "Then, he's hiding something." The next morning, Ekko barked while Dan was reviewing files. Not just a bark, a sharp, precise command. A signal. Dan followed him into the hallway. Ekko stood still, eyes fixed on a floor vent near the living room. He gave a soft whine and tapped the grate with his paw. Dan crouched, heart already picking up pace. He unscrewed the vent and reached in. His fingers brushed fabric. He pulled it out carefully. A small, cloth-covered journal. He flipped it open. Samantha D. October 12, 2016. His blood turned to ice. Another diary, another voice from the dark. He brought it to Mia. She read through it slowly, her eyes narrowing. This girl was kept somewhere, locked in. She writes about hearing footsteps above her, food being left near a door, no windows. In the back pages, a sketcher dog, like Ekko, and the words, "I heard him, but he didn't find me." Dan stared at the drawing. She was real. "No record of a missing girl by that name," Mia said softly. "But the voice in this diary, it's not fiction. There's too much pain." He went back to the barn in Silverside. This time, with federal permission, Ekko led him straight to a floor panel near the back wall. Dan pried it up. Beneath it, a third dugout, blanket, crushed juice boxes. A pair of small ballet slippers, dusty and forgotten. And then came the question Dan hated most: how many didn't we save? They called in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. 3 more crawlspaces were discovered, each one empty but clearly used. The feds reclassified the entire case. No longer isolated incidents, this was organized, calculated. Predatory. Dan stood at the edge of one dugout, breathing through the tightness in his chest. Ekko sat beside him, quiet eyes locked on the darkness below. Then he barked once, sharp and sudden. Or maybe it's something only he could feel. That night, Don read the diary again. This time he highlighted landmarks, times, repeated phrases. 1. Stood out, the house with yellow stairs. No address, no town. Just that same phrase, circled in a child's hand again and again. He called Mia. You ever seen anything about yellow stairs? She paused. Not in any files, but maybe Ekko has. For days they drove. Back roads, forgotten neighborhoods, grainy maps. They stopped at every ranch house, every property with faded siding. Ekko rode up front, head high, always scanning. Nothing. Until Thursday, Don was pouring gas at a station when he looked up and froze. Ekko was standing on the truck's hood, staring across the road. Rigid ears perked, tail low and still. Dan followed his gaze. An old property overgrown, fenced, quiet. The house had peeling white paint, but the stairs faded yellow wood. Wide and chipped, Don dropped the pump and crossed the road. They called it in as a welfare check. Standard protocol. When the local deputy arrived, Don took the lead. They knocked. No answer. Don circled around back. The shed was the first clue. Ekko growled before Dan opened the door. Inside, a cot, a bucket, a chain lock on the outside. A holding pen, Don muttered. A warrant came quickly. Inside the house, only one room had been used. The rest was storage files, handwritten notes, photos, IDs, belongings. Years' worth. Names Dan had never seen. Victims who'd never been connected. 3 more girls were identified from the stash. All had survived. All had been relocated years before. None had told the same story, now they did. Back at Lily's school, Don was invited to speak. Ekko wore his scratched canine vest. Lily was in the front row, taller now, steady. When she saw Ekko, she ran up and hugged him. I told everyone, you saved me, she whispered. But I know you don't like people staring. Dan smiled. He likes kids better than cameras. That night, Dan sat on the porch. The wind was soft. Ekko lay beside him, tail curled, eyes half closed, a rare moment of peace. You did good, Don whispered. Better than good. Ekko didn't stir, but his tail tapped twice. Weeks passed. A call came from the governor's office. They wanted to name a canine training initiative after Ekko. Dan almost declined. But Mia said, it's not for you. It's for the next kid, and the next dog. So Dan agreed in one condition, no statues, no ceremony, just a fund.Ekko response. A program that took shelter dogs like Ekko once was, and trained them as search and support canine south for departments who couldn't afford their own. Within the first year, Ekko Response trained 7 dogs. 4 found missing children. 2 were placed in schools as emotional support companions. 1 retired early and was adopted by a little girl named Leah. First child Ekko ever rescued. She named him Ranger. Dan never wore the badge again. But calls still came. From detectives, teachers, parents. Would he talk to volunteers? Could Ekko sit with a girl before her testimony? Would he mind checking something out? He never charged. He always showed up. Then, one morning, just before Christmas, Dan woke and realized the house was too quiet. Ekko was gone. Not missing, just outside, lying beneath the oak tree. Head turned toward the sun. Still, Don knelt beside him, whispered something only they would understand, and cried. They buried him there. Friends came. So did children he'd helped. Now, older, taller, but with the same wide eyes when they saw the empty leash. Bemamia placed his vest on a chair beside the grave. Dan didn't speak long, just said, he never stopped looking. He never stopped feeling, and he never gave up. That was enough. Months passed. Dan built a bench under the oak tree. People left toys, flowers, notes. One child wrote in crayon. Ekko didn't talk, but I heard him. Dan still drove sometimes, still watched forgotten roads, still listened to the silence. He trained one more dog, not as fast, not as sharp, but willing. One day, during a school fire drill, that dog froze, head tilted, tail stiff. Dan followed him. Behind a locked janitor's closet, they found a 6-year-old girl, curled up, too afraid to call out. Dan smiled. Maybe, just maybe, a little piece of Ekko lived in the instinct to keep searching, in the refusal to walk away, and maybe that was enough to save the next one.